This morning we continue our series in journeying together with Jesus Christ. Last week we spoke about our journey with Christ and how we adjust our lifestyles in order to embrace an entirely different way of life. A life that is giving, a life that is really increasingly becoming less of self and more of Jesus Christ. This morning we're going to be having a little look at the idea of being a welcoming church. And not only a welcoming church, but also a welcoming individual and welcoming households. When we look at the idea of walking with Jesus Christ, the concept of following the image of God, being reprinted and regrafted by Jesus Christ, becomes very, very important. The principle of letting go becomes the operative word. In other words, that we start to let go of an old life and embrace a new life that is found in Jesus Christ. This morning, the spiritual discipline we're looking at is the idea of being hospitable. Hospitable and showing people hospitality. I love a little story that I heard a while ago about a new preacher that came to town, and what he did was he loaded up his car with his large family and drove to visit an old deacon on the farm. And after everyone in the family had introduced himself, there was an awkward pause as the unexpected guests were looking for a seat to sit on. The deacon's living room only had 2 chairs in it. And the preacher said, "Brother, I don't believe you have enough chairs." And the old man said, "That ain't a problem. I've got plenty of chairs. I've just got too much company." Isn't that just a wonderful, wonderful problem to have? We have what we call love where you live. And it's the idea of basically looking at folk that we know and we try to visit with them, spending time with them. And sometimes we have a larger group and sometimes a smaller group that we visit with folks, sometimes that are ill or not feeling well and really can't cope with a lot of people around. And so these groups really and truly, in a loving and kind way, looks as how they can serve to uplift the spirits of those around them. And I want to encourage you to, whenever you can and you get a call, to always say, "Hey, let's make a plan and let's get together. And if we need to get extra chairs, we'll put it in the back of the bucky." Hospitality is actually a mark of a Christian. With that old deacon in mind, 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 9 says, "Show hospitality to one another without grumbling." Romans chapter 12, speaking to the Christians of Rome, he says, "Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality." Romans 12:13. A few chapters later, we can watch, especially knowing the background of the church at Rome, that there was Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians. And Paul was saying is that you guys need to get together. You guys need to really connect. He says to them, "Welcome one another, therefore, as Christ has welcomed you for the glory of God." And then the Hebrew writer writes these words, which are absolutely scary, where he says, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware." One of the qualities of being an elder and a deacon and a church leader in 1 Timothy and Titus, one of the lists of an elder is that he must be hospitable, that they must have people around in their home. They must be able to visit with folk and to show hospitality. And that's the idea of extending yourself out of your comfort zone. And so often I would imagine that many of us have very busy lives and we are exhausted come the end of the week. But God says to us, you need to create space so that you can show hospitality. With all this emphasis in the church, I wonder if we can just drill into the idea of what is hospitality. For example, when I ask you, what is hospitality, I would imagine you would say that, "Oh, hospitality, I know exactly what it's about. Every Sunday we have hospitality. We have the family around for lunch. We have some friends over for dinner, and we spend some time, and it's hospitality on a next level." In other words, we really enjoy each other. But I need you to look a little bit deeper. The Greek word for hospitality is the word called philoxenio. And the idea here is once again a compound Greek word which made up of two words. The one is the idea of philo, and in other words, it has a friendly love or friendship love. And then the word of xenos means a stranger, xenia. And so when we talk about xenia, the context in South Africa at the moment, especially with regards to the poisonous food found in the townships, that people are becoming xenophobic. They're becoming very angry. They're saying you're selling expired good to our children, and we've lost many children through that. And that's why we find that political parties are trying to step in to bring calm. They're trying to bring order and trying to deal with this problem in a very real way. And so what I want us to see is that the idea is philoxenia is not the idea of having your friends and family around, but in fact being kind and loving to strangers. In another way, it is the idea of being able to really outstep your idea of comfort and move into an entirely different view of Christianity. And here's what the key of being a Christian is when we speak of spiritual growth and characterological changes, we often confuse it. And we say, well, I must be like Jesus. And the question is, well, how? And the idea here is we need to be like Jesus who reached out to the stranger. You see, Jesus Christ spoke of love at a different level. It really brings you into the discomfort and extends you into an area where you might need to stretch a little bit. Jesus Christ spoke about the Good Samaritan. Isn't it ironic that he would always use these two people, the Samaritan? A Samaritan, by the way, brethren, was probably a half-breed. They were born out of the captivities between Jews and the captive nations. And so there's this new group of Jewish people that are risen, and they were basically half-breeds, if I can be that. It's not meant in a derogatory term, but so that you can almost see they weren't really loved by their own people, and also the Jews really didn't like them. And then he talks, the lawyer speaks to Jesus and he says, love your neighbor. Jesus tells the lawyer, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he responds very cleverly. He thinks, ek het nou vir Jesus in 'n hoekie, and he says, who is my neighbor? And Jesus then tells him a story. He talks about a man that was on a journey. He was attacked. And all the religious folk walked past and did nothing about it. But in fact, the person who stopped was the Samaritan. He basically exemplified and embodied the essence of hospitality. He made sure the gentleman's immediate needs were met, and he also paid, and he made a commitment that whatever is indebted, he would pay on his return. And we know from that it is a prophetic embodiment of Jesus Christ, because Jesus says, he says, you know what? What you do for others, don't worry. When I get back, I'll repay you for what you've done for those who are in need. You see, many years in the ancient world, they never really had hotels and fancy places that you could stay in overnight. And what people normally used to do, they used to sit in the city square, and they would really hope that somebody of that particular town would come to them and invite them to their home to spend the night and have a meal with them. And that was really the essence of being a traveler. You're at the mercy of folk around you to want to help you. And so traveling in a foreign country is something that was really risky, and it took a lot of courage. They never really had a lot of hotels. No wonder when Jesus Christ was having a little baby, his parents were having him, they went and they lived. The only place that was open was in fact a stable. And so we find that hotels were not really big money spinners during that time. But I want us to stay on the central idea of loving strangers. In fact, we always will need to move out of our comfort zone to be able to help other people. In Luke chapter 14, when you give a dinner banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you'll be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Luke chapter 14, verse 12 through 14. Please, I really hope my wife and Shirley won't be cross with me if I'm going to recount a story. They lost their stepdad on Sunday morning early. And they'd made a commitment to the ladies that they work with in Morning Star that the Monday was going to be a wonderful day for them. They would have a meal with them together at Shirley's home, and they would exchange presents, and they would just enjoy time together. Now, that would have been a wonderful opportunity to say, guys, we can't make it. Please, we've just had a loss in our family. Please, can we postpone it? But Shirley and Sue said, no, we go ahead. And John, the wonderful-hearted man he is, went around and served with everyone to make sure that these folk that they did not know, they could be hospitable to those folk. And I hope you don't see it as being arrogant or elevating anyone, but the idea here is to keep the idea of and your identity forefront and front and center in your life. No matter how you are hurting, you always do what is righteous to stay close to the heart of God. Hospitality is not defined by fine linen and tablecloths and gourmet cooking and elegant crystal and all those kind of things. All it needs is a generous heart to be able to be tegemoetkomend and innemend and be welcoming of people, to take care of others rather than being selfish and nursing your own pain. What about the Jews and hospitality? Well, it's quite interesting that in the Torah, the law of Moses, the Hebrew people who'd experienced harsh oppression in a foreign land were taught to treat strangers in their midst with generosity and respect. God commanded them in Exodus chapter 23, you shall not oppress a sojourner, a foreigner, a stranger. And he goes on to say, you know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. And what God was saying to them, he says, you know what? When you left Egypt, when you were in Egypt, he said, I turned people's hearts favorably toward you. Remember when they left Egypt on their way to Canaan, there were so many people in their neighborhood that gave them stuff so that they could travel that long journey. If you've been in the desert, you will understand that there's not a lot of resources for you to lean on. And so God constantly reminds them, remember when I took you out of Egypt. And this thought of, hang on a minute, I need to be aware where God has been kind to me. There was a time that you were a stranger. You were the one that nobody recognized because you were from a foreign country. You see, way back in Genesis chapter 18, we find that 3 strangers came to Abraham, and he said, the text says the following from verse 1 through to 5. He sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were sitting in front of him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I find favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourself under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourself, and after that you may pass on. You see, the key idea behind it was that he understood one thing, that these people were in need before he knew who they really were. I remember visiting with people in this church, Mariki and Dion and your children, and feeling like I was sitting at a meal of a king. The hospitality is a big deal, brethren. It is massive. And you see, Abraham did not even know that he was hosting angels, but he understood one thing, that he needed to make a plan to help them to feel welcome. I want you to see the extent to which he helped. Abraham tells Sarah to take 3 measures of flour and make some bread. 3 measures or seahs of flour, brethren, was equivalent to 18 liters of flour. Can you imagine the amount of bread that he made available to these people? In other words, he understood one thing, that we need to be generous when we are having strangers within our home. It's interesting to note, I come from a part of Namibia where many times, brethren, you will find that especially those farmers that live in those desert areas, you can go and visit them and you'll feel welcome. In fact, it is practice in our home that when a visitor comes, you vacate your bed and you sleep on the floor so that they can sleep in the comfort of their bed, of your bed. That kind of idea of what hospitality actually is something that is so robbed from us culturally. When you look at the kind of environment that they live in, Thelma Mullins gave me a book many years ago on Bedouins. And the practice of Bedouins is a fact that hospitality is a virtue to this nomadic tribe. In fact, if you go to them and you ask them, please, can I stay with you? Can I come under the house, your protection of your house? They are obligated by the desert law to allow you in. Website says a complete stranger could stay with you as long as 3 days without being asked of his whereabouts. He was considered and treated as a guest and enjoyed the clan's full protection. Isn't that wonderful that when somebody comes into your home, they feel welcome? Hebrews chapter 13 verse 2 says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, because thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Now, what about Jesus? What about Jesus and hospitality? John chapter 2, where Jesus told Peter and Andrew to come where he was staying, and they went and stayed with him that day. Our Lord Jesus Christ was kind, but he was always inclusive. Come, spend time with me. The idea of the hospitality in the stories of the Good Samaritan is crucial for us to know that undergirding to the story lies the heart of God. That he was not only telling the story for story's sake, but he wanted to change the heart fundamentally of the cultural swift, so that ultimately people that are living on the margins will be able to find the kind of inclusivity that they so badly needed, especially in the community of faith. What about the early church and hospitality? Well, what we find is that they became passionate and demonstrated this idea of philoxenia in a wonderful way. In other words, the love of strangers. They would find the people on the margins, the sick, the hungry, the homeless, the destitute, the widows, the travelers. And by doing so, they impacted the world in the most amazing way. In fact, that is why Christianity was the dominant faith all the way through into the 4th century. And I would imagine that the only reason their success, or one of the big reasons, not only was the gospel, but also the embodiment and the encapsulation of the gospel was the hospitality. There was accounts of, during the times of Europe, going through difficult times with catastrophic plagues, something as worse than what we had recently. The 2nd and the 3rd century, hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions of people died. But at the height of one particular epidemic, it's said that 5,000 people died in Rome in one day. But the interesting thing about the Christians was not that they were running away from the plague, but they were running toward the plague to bring people closer, to provide food, clothing, and shelter, and also carrying out the dead so that they can be buried. Hospitality is a big deal. It's interesting to note, and I was just reading through some of the history, and I don't want to bore you with a lot of the stuff, but the idea of hospital was actually not started by the pagan or any government. It was started by Christians. The idea of hospitals was the idea of hospitality. Hospitality was not intended for doctors to tend to people, but in fact was a place that was uniquely put aside so that people could take care of their needs, give them food and something, and a place to sleep. Christian hospitals were there for widows, orphans, strangers, and the poor travelers, as well as the sick. And so you see, right through our history, the idea of hospitality would have brought society together. And it was an important part of weaving that love that we speak about so whimsically, bring it through in a really tangible way. Round about the 4th century, we read that the church in Antioch providing food for the poor people in the area. They fed 3,000 widows and unmarried women every day. And it's wonderful to note that the church has such an incredible track record in ways that was just benevolent, giving to people who in this life would never be able to pay you back. But that's the idea of giving. It's not to get back. It's not to be invited to someone's house hoping they then invite you back. But inviting somebody to your home because you do not ask for it back. You just want to give because it's part of your nature. Why should we show hospitality? I'm going to give you 3 reasons. Firstly, that hospitality flows out of the grateful response for what God has done for you and me. It's the idea that during the life of Egypt, God brought the Egyptians out. He brought you and I out of sin. He brought us out of a life of being rejected. And that is why it's ironic that Paul would speak to the church in Ephesians and he would tell them, he said in verse 14 of chapter 2, for he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, destroying the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in the flesh the law and its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity, one out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who were far away and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have access to God, to the Father by one Spirit. Consequently, we are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. He says, you know what? You're not xenos anymore. You are now part of God's household. In the same way, we want the same for others. When somebody comes through our door that feels a bit strange, we say, we want you to be part of us. We want you to make this your home, where you can spiritually thrive and that you can know our Lord, that you can spread the love of God, not only among us, but also to those outside. And the second way, hospitality is one of the ways that he expressed our love to Jesus. In Matthew 25, it says, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we do all that? And the king will answer, truly I say to you, you did it to one of the least of my brothers, you did it to me. You know, brethren, when I sat just watching the hearts of folk in the Versantacral literacy program, that's what I see. That's what I see. The illiteracy is staggering in that community. And that is a group of committed folk that says, I cannot sit idly by and watch how this becomes larger and larger. People that have been created in the image of God, I have to become part of that. And I pray that God would touch your heart in a way that you say, you know what, me sitting and doing nothing on a Saturday morning is for the birds. And be a part of a program that changes the world. The question on the table is, do you just want to idle along in your walk of faith? Or do you want to be a world changer? What's it going to be? When you stand before God one day and he asks you, listen, what have you done with your life? You say, well, you know. Well, I do know. You wasted it away. Maybe you should stop being a complainer and being someone who gets involved in the thick of things and change the lives of people that in their lifetime will never be able to pay you back. And note the corollary to that, the same way you can never pay Jesus back, but you can pay it forward. Thirdly, hospitality gives us the opportunity to be like God. Luke chapter 14, when you throw a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. He told a parable about a man who threw a banquet, and when those he had invited didn't show up, he said to his servant, go out quickly to the streets, the lanes, and the cities, and bring in the poor and crippled and the blind and the lame. He said, bring everyone in so they can enjoy in this banquet. You see, brethren, theologically, this is not a small point. This is massive. Because when you and I show hospitality, we are more like Jesus in a real way. Maybe the question needs to be asked, why don't we show hospitality? And the reason sometimes is very innocuous. And it's not an ugly reason. And sometimes it's because we often feel a bit nervous. We feel uncomfortable because it is sometimes we don't know what people's expectations are. We don't know whether we are meeting or exceeding their expectations. And we sometimes feel that, will people reject or will they accept? Here's the key. You see, brethren, the idea is just to do it with one family. Just have them at your home. and just sit down and say, you know what? I would like to have you over to have a meal with me. Secondly, and this relates to what we spoke about last week, is literally to try to meet the needs of others. Our lives are so busy, crowded with appointments. We have to be at ball games, we have to be here, there, and everywhere, and countless activities. And sometimes hospitality doesn't even get onto the list. But you know what, brethren? That's the one area where you can really and truly extend your family. In the third place, and this is probably the biggest reason, is fear. We fear sometimes. We fear of being harmed. We're afraid of being rejected. But you know what, brethren? I have never come across someone who has been invited to a home and not walked away fulfilled. Many years ago, I went to visit someone, and this guy said to me, please come in. I sat down, and we were doing a Bible study that night, and it was a gentleman that obviously didn't have a lot. And as I sat down, at the table, I did not know what to expect. He took out a loaf of bread, and he proceeded to cut off the bread into slices. I looked at this and I wondered what's going to happen now. He said, it is customary in our home that you have what you need. You can have first. And around the table was his wife and his children, his three children. I said to him, you know, the part of the bread that I really like is the crust. And they all looked at each other and they said, well, we too. So I said, well, too bad. I'm having it. And I had a piece of chicken. I said, thank you very much. I really appreciate this. And I had it. And only then, the husband ate first, then the children, and then the wife. And I watched this dynamic within this family. You know, brethren, it felt like I was having a meal with a king and his family. And you know, brethren, sometimes we think it's got to be very fancy. It's got to have just the best. But you know what? If that is your best, then that's also okay. An author wrote the following. He says, not everyone can serve in a foreign land, lead a relief effort, or volunteer at a downtown soup kitchen. But who can't be hospitable? Do you have a front door, a table, chairs, bread and meat for sandwiches? Congratulations, you just qualified to serve in the most ancient of ministries, hospitality. Something holy happens around a table, but will never happen in a sanctuary, in a church auditorium. You see the backs of heads. Around the table, you see the expressions of faces. In the auditorium, one person speaks. Around the table, everyone has a voice. Church services are on the clock. Around the table, there is time to talk. And brethren, you know what? I want to encourage you to lean into this. For this time, especially when you know that there are people who have lost loved ones. And you know what, brethren? That's not uncommon. That when God has raised up his children as a church, it also becomes a place of healing. Where people can heal when they're around your table. And you are sending a message to them. You matter to me and to God. And you may think you are saying, come over for a visit. But what your guest hears, I am worth the effort. Let's change this year, the end of the year, into a year of really stretching into our discomfort, but also closer to the comfort of our Redeemer, that he can say, that's my kids, man, look at them. They're inviting those who really and truly would have been on the margins, but we've included them into our homes. If you need to obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ this morning, or if you need the prayers, hey, this is the time that we do that.